I would like to go to the main part of today, focusing on the most common sources of microbiological issues. So what will be discussed today? First of all, I will give a brief introduction and then we'll focus on raw materials, packaging materials, the factory environment, insufficient or ineffective cleaning, people and behavior, air ventilation systems, and product formulation. And this already kind of gives a flavor on the key areas which are the most common sources of microbiological contaminations, of microbiological issues. But we'll go into all of these in much more detail. Let's start with the introduction. Here you see an overview of the number of food safety notifications over the last 12 months in the main HACCP related categories. So that's chemical, physical, microbiological, allergens and radiological. And the information is taken from VERA Horizon Scan and it includes all the notifications around the globe. And what we see is that currently pesticides are the biggest category. And traditionally that's not the case, but because we have a huge issue in the European Union involving ethylene oxide, we see that all of a sudden chemical contaminants, or to be more precise, pesticides, are currently, over the last 12 months, the biggest issue. And number two, which is traditionally the number one, is microbiology. So microbiological contaminations are a big source of recalls, are a big source of food safety notifications around the globe. If we look into more detail into these microbiological issues, we see that salmonella and listeria are strongly dominating the landscape, and they're followed by aflatoxins in the third spot. And of course, there's a few others as well. But we see that especially salmonella and listeria have a big impact. And we'll see much more about salmonella and listeria in today's presentation. Let's now move into all the areas where we see the most common sources of microbiological issues. And we'll make a start, of course, with the raw materials. So raw materials, we see that there are certain high-risk raw materials which have their own signature in terms of microbiological issues. And we're going to discuss these one by one in a moment. So first of all, we have meat and poultry, then fish as a high-risk raw material, eggs, dairy, agricultural commodities, herbs and spices, and last but not least, dry powder products. And I will now discuss one by one each of these high-risk raw materials and what are the specific risks that are there in terms of microbiological contamination. So first of all, let's focus on meat and poultry. This is where we see a lot of incidences of salmonella and listeria and E. coli. Those are the key three categories that we see in these products. But where do salmonella, listeria and E. coli come from? Let's have a look at the typical sources of these. First of all, they can of course come from the farm environment. A farm environment isn't always very clean. There might be manure and so on, and animal feces lying out and about. And of course, that's where salmonella especially and E. coli will be present. And listeria, you might say, is omnipresent. It is just already present in street dirt. So the external farm environment is already not a very clean place. And if animals are contaminated, either on the exterior or even internally with these, of course, then it might end up in your meat or poultry. But also the animal gut, which is still in the animal while it's being slaughtered, and the feces that might be there could be a source of contamination. So that's why slaughtering is such an enormously important process, that it happens in a hygienic way, and contamination from the gut to the carcass doesn't take place. And of course there's a lot of focus on this, but there's always a risk of contamination. And after slaughtering, of course, we have what we call the meat processing facilities. And also there you could get a source of salmonella, listeria and E. coli, because all these bacteria have a tendency to be able to harbor in the environment, as we'll see later on. So quite often meat processing plants and abattoirs, they do have some pets in a sense that they have a presence of E. coli, that they have a presence of listeria or salmonella that in the end might potentially end up in the product stream. Let's look at the next category, fish. In fish, we typically see listeria as the biggest one, and then salmonella and E. coli and the norovirus and Clostridium botulinum as the key bacteria and viruses that are present in these products. So where does this all come from? Well, first of all, fish lives in water, so it might come from polluted water. Not all the water in our rivers, in the oceans, is totally clean. It certainly contains human and other feces or fecal products, so therefore listeria, salmonella and E. coli and Clostridium botulinum might be there. And the same thing holds true for the norovirus, because it is also entering living organisms through a fecal oral route. So if fish eat poo, that's where they potentially get infected with the norovirus. And we see that especially some clams, for example, are prone to this because they filter a lot of water and therefore pick out those viruses much more easier. So polluted water is one of the major sources for these bacteria and the norovirus to end up in fish products. But again, the second source is the fish processing facility, because these bacteria, if they are entering a processing facility through the raw material, they might stay there and harbor in some places and actually be a source of contamination from within the production facility. Another big class of high-risk products are, of course, eggs. And in eggs, we typically see salmonella as the key bacteria. And the sources that we have here are either it's already in the egg, and that could be because the bird is contaminated with salmonella. And of course, there's a lot of oversight in farms around the globe. But still, chickens sometimes do catch salmonella themselves, and then the salmonella might already be transferred into the egg via the chicken. It can also be on the egg, and that's through the animal feces route. So if a contaminated chicken, or if there's chicken which are contaminated in the neighborhood and the egg comes in contact with the feces of that chicken, then it might create an external contamination of the egg. And of course, the same thing holds true for the farm environment, which isn't always overly clean.